Hi everyone. So for part 2 of this video addressing our first unit, summarizing a few key points, and then pivoting to our second unit, which will engage with Chinese philosophical Taoism and something that we'll think of as the ecological thought. More to come on that later. For part 2, I'd like to talk a little bit about Cave of Forgotten Dreams as one of our documentaries that are part of that unit on the question of the documentary. And of course, it's the question of how do we document something as extensive in scope and scale as the question of the Anthropocene. Well, one way that Werner Herzog gets us to think about the kinds of things that are part of the question of the Anthropocene, deep time, obviously, what it is and what it means to be human, where we came from, where we are now, and where we might be going, all of these together, one way Werner Herzog gets us to think about this stuff is to juxtapose or to compare a scientific worldview, which I've addressed in the previous video, that empirical mapping of the world, right? Gathering data, empirical evidence, and using that as a basis for talking about what is. Right? So Herzog does that by talking to all these scientists. Then he juxtaposes or compares that with these other questions that are really part of what we study in the humanities, things like religious belief, art, how we make stories, whether they're stories that we write in the form of novels or that people have told in some oral form, that maybe anthropologists or ethnographers gather from talking to people in various parts of the world, and so on, right? So we have two things. We have the scientific worldview and the data side of things, the empirical evidence. And then we have this other question of, well, what is it to be human? What is it to feel inspired in a way that is difficult to quantify scientifically, right? And inspiration means breathing in, right? To feel that we are breathing in something that is more than just physical air, and that our bodies are more than just physical bodies, that there's something that is mysterious and deep and profound about our existence, that we struggle at times to get a hold on. And Herzog argues that film and perhaps documentary film can tap into, giving us these moments of, these flashes of ecstatic truth, poetic ecstatic truth, where it's not just a matter of data sets and empirical evidence, but also something deeper and more profound. And I wanted to look at a scene in which that's really, I think, done pretty well in Cave of Forgotten Dreams, when Herzog interviews this former circus performer and present-day archaeologist, Julien Monet. So we have this passage where Herzog is, of course, giving us
today
this view of
every single millimeter of
the cave,
using laser scanners.
mapped it with laser
The
scanners.
position of every feature in the cave is known.
Right, and so everything is known. But it's also, of course, a map. It's a representation of reality which corresponds closely to reality, but does it equal that reality? Is it equivalent to that reality? We'll be talking a little bit as we get into the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, thinking about the extent to which the symbolic representation that we use to try to understand the world in language, in visual culture, in all sorts of ways, the extent to which that is or isn't equivalent to that which it claims to represent. In other words, is this very rich data set that shows us the interior of the cave adequate to telling us what the cave is. As we listen to Julien Monet talk about what he does, I'm going to turn the sound down. And we can see that he's talking about these scientific methods, this precision that they bring to bear, but that's not the main goal, right? Here he tells us the main goal is to have stories. And for this, we have to access our imagination. We have to recreate something that is impossible to recreate in a sense, right? What the lives of the people in those caves were like. And it's not just a kind of exercise in imagination. In a sense, if we think about deep time, it's also an exercise in imagination that we embody. In other words, we are descended from these people. There is a direct link in our bodies, in our DNA, right, to these people. So here we have Monet talking about this idea of being a human being, a scientist, right, somebody who studies the data, but also who has this profound experience, this deep experience of dreaming about lions. And these are lions that no longer live on the continent of Europe. They're cave lions. They're extinct, right? So we're connected in this deep sense, arguably, through a film like this, to not necessarily the past in the sense that it is gone, but in that we don't necessarily see it or comprehend it as being present very often. And if we do, perhaps that's the ecstatic truth. That's the poetic ecstatic truth. I wanted to look at this scene to think about where we're headed. We're headed into a unit in which we go back to a different period of time, a period in time in which Chinese culture begins to take its form in an identifiable way. And this has to do with Lao Tzu, in this case, and the roots of philosophical Taoism for our purposes. We won't be spending time thinking about ritualistic or religious Taoism or claims to magic or supernatural powers, but rather thinking about the model of the world that texts like the Lao Tzu give us, okay, like the Tao Te Ching give us, and how that's influenced and affected some ways in which people think about the world and ecology today. So we're looking at going back 8,000 years before present, 6,500 years before present, 3,000 years before present, into Southeast Asia, right? Into Eastern Asia too, into China, right? And thinking about what's going on at this time as new technologies make intensive, extensive farming and rice production possible, and how that changes the way people live, and how those changes register in the earliest records of Chinese civilization that we have. And we won't be going all the way back, but we'll be thinking a little bit about earlier stuff as well before we get to Lao Tzu. And we'll be reading a little bit about how and why we might think of this philosophical Taoism as being relevant to contemporary ecology and the question of the Anthropocene. To help us do that, I'm asking you to read just the abstract of an academic journal article from a journal called The Holocene about China 8,000 to 2,000 years before present. That's what BP stands for. And what was going on in the mid to late Bronze Age, 3,600 to 2,200 years before present. What's going on in the early dynastic period. And these are time frames within which the figure of Lao Tzu fits. And by the way, Lao Tzu may or may not have been an actual person. I don't want people to claim that he's this actual guy who we have any documentary evidence of having existed. He may be kind of aggregate fiction, and the Lao Tzu text, it might contain things that were gathered over centuries by sages and put into form as a single text. There's no strong evidence that an actual person named Lao Tzu existed, but there are lots of stories, right? And again, this tension between fact on one hand and a kind of deeper truth, to think in terms of Werner Herzog on the other, might be relevant. Technically, we need to think about the fact that Lao Tzu wasn't this one guy. In terms of truth, we can think about what this text attributed to this legendary figure, Lao Tzu, can tell us about who we are, where we came from, and where we might be going, and how we might go somewhere better than worse. So that's where we're headed. It's kind of complex. By the end of this relatively short unit, you'll be ready to write your second essay that will have to do with some of these concepts we're pulling from early Chinese philosophy, Timothy Morton's idea of the ecological thought, which we'll get to more later, and the question of the Anthropocene. All right, stay tuned for more, and this guy is here with me now in all of his glory.